Now I am really happy to give the floor to Wessel Badenhorst, our ad hoc expert and specialist of placemaking and urban facilitation. So Wessel, the floor is yours, and we are really curious to listen from you about the principles of placemaking. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm excited. I'm happy to be here, and I see faces. I'd like to, if you wouldn't mind, whilst we are all in the room without any share screening, if you would just open your video so we can see your faces, and then if you wouldn't mind, in your if you go into the participant list, if you can just next to your name say which city are you from or which project are you from, just so we because for instance there's two 𝐿𝐴s, so we know which 𝐿𝐴s is from which city. You might know each other, but I don't know you, so I need some information a bit about yourselves. That'll be very helpful. And I just want to say I see some faces from the past, from my past. So there are people in the room who I've walked the road with before. Danny is there. Hi, Danny. And what I want to say is there's just from the Mentimeter already, there's collectively so much knowledge in our room. And what I hope we can do is we can share our knowledge because collectively we would have so much to learn from each other on the topic of placemaking. And just looking at the Mentimeter, I can already see a lot of very good insights on placemaking. So I'm going to go through a presentation, but what I want to do is make it as interactive as possible. So I've got two rules. One is you can interrupt me at any time. You can speak over the presentation. I don't care. And you can also use, please, the chat box for your ideas and your own perspectives. So for instance, if you've got nice photographs that you want to put in, or you've got a nice example, or another perspective that you want to bring, or put it in the chat box for us, please. That'll be very useful. So I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, that's classic. Now, I want to know if you can see the big one.
Sorry,
I'm just
Yes, you can see perfectly. Which?
No, it's not that one. Sorry.
Yes,
Yeah.
I can see it.
I know you can see. I need to on my other screen, on my screen 2, screen 1. There we go. Share. Okay. So I want to be able to see you all whilst I'm doing this thing. Yeah, that's it. Okay. So is it the full screen?
Yes.
Thank you. So we're going to start with what is placemaking. And I'm going to give you a working definition. And a lot of what you were saying in the Mentimeter was actually already very useful because you referred to the public space and how you see the use of a public space. And so when we talk about placemaking, we're actually talking about turning these public spaces into great places. And what we mean by great is what this whole discussion about the principles will be about. Sorry, have I got the right one open? Yeah, okay, I do. Can you see the working definition?
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right. And it's important also to know that when we talk about places, we make a reference to how people use places, and the presence of people in places is a key factor to decide how places are being used and what influence they have in our lives. So we try to increase user participation and stakeholder cooperation when we talk about public spaces. Now, it's very interesting in the word cloud, when people were asked the question about what, in your perspective, would make a place a great place, you immediately said people, play, and fun. Those three words came out quite strongly. And that's correct. And also, you made some other comments. Now, I tried to very quickly put some of your ideas together as I was looking. That's why I asked for the screenshots, because I'm not that good at trying to capture people's ideas and put it back into my own presentation. But there were some brilliant observations that you made. So I want you to continue in the chat box and just say what you think makes a great public space. Now, the word good and the word great is actually two different dimensions. Good is kind of okay. Great is when you really, really want to go back to a place. Great is when you talk to other people about it, when your city is very proud of the place, when a neighborhood is connected because it's great. So I'm now kind of undoing my own thing here now, but it's very important that we aspire to great public places, and that's what placemaking is about. So if we can just, in your chat box, just ideas about what you think makes a great public space, and some of the thoughts you had now refer or are elements that refer to that. So the openness for people, the accessibility, the fact that it's got trees, flowers, benches, the fact that it's well planned and it's beautiful, a place that's a space where you can get around or get together and you can run around, you can read, there's shadow where you can rest in the shadow, there's green. A lovely one that somebody said is feeling free to do what you want without judgment. That was very, very interesting. This freedom, this notion, quite a few of you made the connection between freedom and public space. And we can speak about that a bit more later. And then this notion that it's a place where people can mix together, and mixing together also has the element of social inclusion. So these were all elements that you brought up as ideas, what makes a great public space. And what I want to do in this session, the first session, is use a tool which was developed by an organization in New York called the Project for Public Spaces. Now, I must say that there are people in the room that also have that knowledge of placemaking, so I'm not the only one, yes, and they're very welcome to come in from their perspective as well. 𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿 is here, Danny's gone through this, Ileana knows it quite well. So what I'm saying is probably something some of you know quite well, but that's fine. We can just go through it again. So Project for Public Spaces, about, what was this, in the 1970s, started looking at research about public spaces and what happens in public spaces. And specifically, New York City Council asked them to look at spaces where there were real problems with drug use and all kinds of problems in New York. If you can remember 1970s, 1980s, New York City wasn't this razzle-dazzle place at all. It was seen as a city that's dying. It was a real problem city. And so they thought that they needed to clean slums and clean public spaces out. And they got the Project for Public Spaces to kind of come up with recommendations how they can clean out the problems in the public spaces. But from the research, something quite the opposite came. And the opposite was, well, it's actually about people. And so how people use the public space is the main definition or the main function. And then they came up with something they call a tool, which is called the place diagram. So what I'm going to present to you is the place diagram. And the most important thing maybe to know is that there's 4 quadrants in the place diagram. There's 4 big areas when you look at a public space and you judge a public space. So if you want to know what makes a great public space, you look at something called the sociability in the space. And we'll see what actually means sociability. You look at the uses and the activities in the space. You look at the comfort and the image, and you look at the access and the linkages. Now, if we go back to the Mentimeter, all four of these quadrants were covered in the comments people made. So I'm actually going to take what you said in the Mentimeter, and then I'm going to give you the questions and how you can systematically look at a great place, and then be able to make your analysis. And then I'll talk to you about how we then go into a process of placemaking. So let's take the first one, sociability. Oh, sorry, let me show you the place diagram. So this, you'll get this one. We'll send it to everybody afterwards. And they basically decided they'll put all the factors from their research into one diagram. And this is called the place diagram. And you can see there's the 4 quadrants: sociability, uses and activities, comfort and image, access and linkages. And then the next ring, so that's the core quadrants, but the next ring they call the key attributes, the intangibles. And they say, well, if we talk about sociability, we can say it depends on how diverse the people are that use the space. Is there an element of stewardship? Is there neighborliness? Is there pride in the place? Are people friendly? So that was what they call the intangibles. But the question is, you can't measure intangibles, but you can measure elements which are indicators of sociability. And that's the last ring you see there. So some of those measurements include, for instance, number of women, children, and elderly that use the public space. Are there indications of social networks? Are there indications of volunteerism? What is the kind of evening use taking place? What's the street life around the public space like? So these were all measures that you could look at to decide if it's a great place in terms of sociability. The same again with uses and activities, the same with comfort and image, and the same with access and linkages. So I'm not going to go through each of them, but afterwards you can use this as a very practical tool when you want to make an analysis of a public space and ask yourself, where do we stand? And you can make a baseline data of it by doing an evaluation. And then you can say from there, you want to improve the public space on those measures and those elements that you can see, those intangibles that you see there. So let's go to the detail. If you take accessibility, for instance, here's some basic questions you can ask yourself. Is this a place where you would choose to meet your friends? Do people make eye contact with each other in this space? Do people use the place regularly and by choice? So again, the judgment of a great place is how people use the place. And when we say people, who are the people that use the space is obviously very important, the diversity of people. And is it a place where people are comfortable to meet? Is it a place where people make eye contact? Now, some people tell me, well, that could be cultural, that in certain cultures, it's not the thing to make eye contact. I still have to meet those people from those cultures. It's a human thing for people to acknowledge each other by making eye contact. And often I find that when people tell me there's not such a thing as eye contact, it's more a hierarchy thing of certain people that shouldn't be meeting other people. That's so eye contact for me is really important. The next one, uses and activities. Are people using the space? Are there different types of activities occurring in the space? So when we say activities, we don't necessarily always mean organized activities. And this is very important for play. So one of the things you see in public spaces that municipalities love to do is they create a little corner which they call the playground. And they say, that's where you play. The problem with the playground is it defines function. It's a classic planner's approach. You know, let's have uses all sketched out, and this is where you play, meaning you don't play somewhere else. And sometimes you get in public spaces signs that say, no balls, no, don't kick the ball here, don't kick it somewhere else. So when we've got these signs, we have to ask ourselves, what have we done with the space? Now, sometimes you need order in the space, and sometimes you've created, call it control in the space, which you have to ask yourself, isn't there inadvertent consequence of less use of the space? So what kind of activities and where do they occur? That's quite important. Are there choices for people to do things? And are there people from different ages that can do different things in the space? And typically, if you do an observation of a public space, you want to see what happens early in the morning in the public space. You want to see what happens in the daytime, midday, in the afternoons, in the evenings. Good public or great public spaces have different uses at different times and have different activities that they do. And I'm not talking about everything having to be an organized activity. People have rituals and patterns that they develop. So they might walk their dog in a public space, or they might play dominoes with other people in the public space. There's different types of activities, and it's not all facilitated and organized. And very important, some spaces have to, there's actually spaces that should be quiet spaces, and there's quite a few people who made that comment on the Mentimeter as well. So it's not that every space must be chock-a-block full of people. So which spaces are used, and are there other spaces that are unused, that are more quiet, contemplative spaces, we call them. Then the comfort and image, that's probably the one that we all respond to. So if somebody asks us, is that a great place? We go to the physical attributes. We look at, oh, look at all the lovely flowers and the trees, and that's all good, and that's really important. But it's one of the quadrants. It's just one element of how you judge a great place. So what's the first impressions of the place? Will people be taking pictures of the place? Are there enough places to sit? Are seats conveniently located? There's two things that any public space can be improved on, and that's through trees and seats. So you'll hear people say that if you want to make a difference, plant trees and put seats in there. And you don't have to have a fixed seats. You can just have seats that are loose chairs. We'll speak about that later. And then quite important is this feeling of safety and the feeling of cleanliness. So do people feel the public space is clean? Do they feel it's an area that's safe? Now, you know both are related to human behavior. So in other words, if people respect the place, you will have less litter. And if people respect each other, people feel more safer. So it's actually the human behavior side that has to be managed, rather than always having people picking up others or having all kinds of security arrangements, although I do acknowledge that lighting is really, really important. Next one, access and linkages. Can people easily walk to a place? Can they get easily in this public space? Can they walk to it, and can they walk in it? Is there good connection between the space and the adjacent buildings? Sometimes you find that spaces can be isolated, quite isolated. And sometimes a space can link in very strongly with the adjacent buildings. It's sometimes better that the space links in with the adjacent building, but you can understand when it's the other way around as well. The important thing is what are the obstructions? So when you look at access and linkages to the public space, for instance, if there's only one entrance to the public space, yes, that's a safety measure, but it does restrict the use of the space as well. So understanding that and understanding how the space works is quite important. Does the space function for people with special needs? Now, I know some of the presentations would speak about that as well, and that's really, really important. It's becoming more important as we go along. Simple things like, how do we design benches? How do we get people who are in a wheelchair to sit at a table? You know, those are all things that have to be taken in consideration. How do you make sure that somebody can, who are blind, can use a public space? How do you make it the sensory place? All of those are elements that can be brought in. So before I go into the process of placemaking, maybe just if I've now talked to quite a lot, so I just want to hear some comments or any questions people have on the placemaking diagram or the place diagram and the 4 quadrants. And I'll listen also to some of the other people who have been very much involved in placemaking. And if you don't want to speak, you can throw something in the chat box.
Can you repeat what people have to share?
Yeah, no, all people have to do is, this is just a pause for people who want to maybe comment on the place diagram. And let me just go back to
about the 4 dimension.
Yeah, I'm just going to go quickly back to it.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I am really curious to listen from the city, which told that they are really used to promote placemaking. I don't know if you answer that. that answer the question. Sorry, Wessel.
When you say, just repeat your question again. Sorry, Liana.
Oh, sorry. I think that maybe someone that answer in the Mentimeter that in their city they are really used to promote placemaking activities.
Oh, yeah, I answered.
If they wanted to start, you answer that.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. So the others.
No, I saw. There's only one.
Yeah.
No, it's me. Yeah.
Okay, too.
No, I think I'm very privileged. I've been involved quite a lot with placemaking. I've also been to New York, and I've worked with the Project for Public Spaces. I've been working with them afterwards as well. So yeah, that's why I answered that way. But I do think what I can say to you is, if you use in your own project this diagram, you don't have to use every element of the diagram. But if you pick, for instance, your measures that you want to look, say you want to look at, for instance, environmental data. So some of that environmental data is you want to measure the air quality. So these days, with all the new sensors that we have and so on, you could maybe say, well, we want to make sure that we've got good air quality. Or you could say, we want to make sure that we know how the pedestrian patterns work. So you can do something called, you can have little sensors that measure the pedestrian activity, where people are walking. So there's different ways of starting to measure and see. You can look at your traffic data. You can look at your use in the evenings. You can literally see, some of us do observations. So we do a half an hour every evening, and we'll see and just look at how the public space is used in the evenings. And these things are very important to do for a simple reason, and that is we need to move away from just our own logic or perception of what would be great to do in a public space. We have to go with some data and evidence that shows us what's happening in the public space. And also
there is Walter. Would you like to take the floor from Jelgava?
Yeah, I have a question. I have one question.
Sorry, I saw your hand now. Yeah.
No, I just raised a hand. The question is, what you do with some places that you make, and some youth or somebody else damage it or break the chairs and demolish places. How you deal with that?
All right, and that's a great question, because I think I'm going to go into the placemaking process next. I wanted to address the question of what is a great place first. But Walters, that's a very good question that leads me into how the placemaking process works. So maybe I'll go to that now.
Yeah, there is also another question. Maybe you can keep for
okay,
in the chat box from Rita from Turin. She asked about the communication. What about the communication dealing with placemaking?
Okay, all right. So all of that is now process questions. So let me deal with the process. So again, from Project for Public Spaces, they've come up with a 5-stage process. It's an iterative process, iterative meaning it's ongoing process, but it starts with defining a place and identifying stakeholders. And this is going to deal with communication as well as a certain process, how placemaking works. Placemaking is not urban design. I cannot stress this more and too much. Placemaking is not urban design. It's not landscaping. It's not a person coming in and making a place better through design. Placemaking is a process where people get together and work together to increase, to make a place better. And that better now, what are we looking for? What do we want to make better? That's why we've got a place diagram. Those are the aspects we want to work on for placemaking, because what you're measuring is what's going to get done. So how do we define a place? We use the place diagram for that. How do we, and define also means we identify a specific place. We don't generalize, we focus on a specific place. And I've asked you to give me photographs of places. We'll go into detail when we look at those places. And then you identify stakeholders for that specific place. And those stakeholders are local stakeholders. Now, the word stakeholders, some people say, well, what do you mean by the word stakeholders? That's the interest groups. So, for instance, it could be local retailers. It could be women who want to take their babies or their children to the place. That could be a stakeholder. It could be young boys who want to play with the ball. It could be all. So you define your stakeholders and you identify them and you define the place. That's a first step in placemaking. And then here's the magic. You bring those people together. So now the question is, how do you bring those people together? There's many ways to do that. And you'll find that this is very similar to the URBACT methods. So participation in, for instance, co-design or co-planning or whichever process you want to call it, but basically bringing people together and asking them, what is it about a place that makes it a good place? What do they want to do in a place? How would they do it themselves? So they evaluate the space and they identify the issues. You bring those people together. That's the second stage. And that evaluation of the space and the place, that's really important. That's where also a lot of the communication takes place, because the communication is not just a vertical communication. It's a horizontal communication between stakeholders. Yes, you have the municipality present. Yes, you have maybe landowners or people with money or people like that, people who have influence, you have them present. But most important is the users, because we believe that placemaking in the end is made by the users themselves. And that to me is really the secret, because if you can influence the users and if the users work together, you can get to a stage which we call self-management. And when 𝐸𝐤𝐸 does her presentation, I hope she refers to some of the examples we saw in Madrid, where you can see places which have gone to that stage where there's self-management, which is something else. It's really impressive. When you have this evaluation of the spaces and identifying of issues, it leads to people coming together and agreeing, well, this is actually where we want to go with this place. Yes, it helps to facilitate those discussions so that you arrive at a vision. And the word vision, yes, it comes from management theory and it comes from businesses that use terms like this, but it's actually really important in this case. It is a picture in people's minds of what they want to see happening in a place. So it's a vision in like the word vision, the visual, what you can see can happen in the place. And so facilitating that in such a way through projects like this, where people can actually make a picture for themselves of what the place could look like, is really helpful. And then, as Ileana pointed out when we did the Mentimeter, she picked up the word test a few times. So what do we mean by test? We mean that when you start placemaking, you start with experimentation. You start with trying things. So you don't go through a process of deciding, oh, well, maybe this or maybe that. You test things. So I've given you an example there on the left-hand side. You can see a picture there. It's from a city in Italy, quite close to where Ileana lives. It's called San Donato di Piave. It's in Veneto region. And they are a small city, and they try to say, we want to change how our streets work. And by the way, I've got interesting news for you. A street is also a public space. And this is going to be fun when we start figuring that one out. What does a street mean if it's also a public space? So what they wanted to do is they wanted to kind of take away the domination that the cars have in their city. And they wanted to make the streets much more a space where people can actually use it for different other uses. And this is 6-7 years ago when they started this process. And what they did is they tested the making of small, what we call parklets, little grass areas, which they put it where the parking space used to be. They put this down, then you can see they put some flowers there. You can't see it, but if you look down, you'll see there's some places where you could sit down, and where there's an umbrella that they, or a pagoda that they put up just to, for people to be able to, or parasol, sorry, to put a parasol there for people just to sit under. So the idea was how they can get people to test other uses for the street. So testing means you are prepared to fail. I think that's really, really important. When you do placemaking, it's not about always being right. It's actually very good to be wrong sometimes, because you have to learn, and you can only learn sometimes by trying something and it doesn't work. And so it's this try and test, try and fail, try again, see what works, see what doesn't work. That's placemaking. So it's forever trying something, because nobody's got, we call it a monopoly on the ideas and what will work best. That's why it's not designer-led at all. It is this messy process of people trying to do things to make it better. And if it's short-term experiments, it also means that it's not so expensive. But quite important here for you is that it doesn't stay with short-term experiments. The next phase, and the final phase, is reevaluation, ongoing, seeing what experiments work, and then making a strong case for long-term improvements, and then trying to get the investment for long-term improvements. So typically when you see a municipality saying, oh, we're going to now change a place, and they come up with landscaping designs and so on, many of us who are placemakers, we just start doing this, and we say, oh, here we go again. Because there's no testing at all. There's no what's actually the discussion with people. There's no having a bit of patience to see what can happen in the place. No, it's unfortunately vanity projects when people go landscaping first. That's the reality of it. And unfortunately, you can see all over cities landscaping projects. You see the design and you see what ends up, and it becomes dead spaces. There's no other word for that. That's a sad story. So I'm going to stop here. And I'm going to just quickly touch on, Ileana, you must stop me in terms of time now, but I just want to quickly touch on, can the results of placemaking be more playful spaces? That question was also asked in Mentimeter. And I think it's very important that people made a few statements here. This is what we learned from the first Playful Paradigm project. We learned that play brings people together, and placemaking is about bringing people together, so it's a perfect match. The emphasis in placemaking is often on getting more activities to animate public spaces rather than on new design features, and play is an excellent way to animate public spaces. Placemaking is about going cheap and cheerful, what I explained to you now, and also about reusing and repurposing material. Playful placemaking is also about using affordable materials like chalk or even natural objects like the trunk of a fallen tree. It helps to have a targeted approach, say for instance, young people, older people, women and girls. This will influence factors such as types and times of play, safety, and who to include in placemaking. So I've got a question for you. Should creating more playfulness be a specification in your city for organizing activities in public spaces or design new features? And I'm going to leave that question. It's a rhetorical question for you to take with you. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop sharing quickly.